Hi friends, I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but let me show you why I stopped using a 57 on the snare and changed to 4 mics on one drum. Listen for yourself. Today I'm talking about the snare drum and how to level up your sound to get the best possible tones from arguably the most important drum. But before we get started, I want to ask you to like and subscribe so that way I can keep creating content that you want, just like this video. On snare top, I'm using an SE Electronics V7 dynamic microphone, and that's going through a BAE 1023 preamp and EQ. And then to pair with that, I'm using a Telefunken M60 pencil condenser that's going through a BAE 1066 preamp and EQ. And then I'm getting a little compression help for that mic through the DBX 560 compressor. Then on snare bottom, to capture the snare wires, is another Telefunken M60, and that's going through another BAE 1073 preamp, and then going through an IGS 500 series EQ. And then my bonus mic is a Shure SM57 coming right over the kick drum, pointed at the shell of the snare drum. And that's going through a BAE 1073 as well. And then it's getting squashed by a TONELUX compressor, the TC5X. Coming up, I'll explain the purposes for each mic, but right now I'm going to solo each individual track so you can hear how each mic complements each other. So first things first, the snare drum is just like the kick drum. They're not all created equally. They come in different shapes, different sizes, made from different materials. You can put different kinds of heads on them, use different wires, you can play them differently. So the combination is really what makes each snare drum unique. Today I'm using a CRAVIOTTO 7x14 ash snare drum with a REMO coated ambassador on top and a REMO hazy snare side head on the bottom. The reason I use the REMO ambassador is because it's one of REMO's thinnest heads, and I love the way that it disperses the overtones. It's not a thick head that really focuses the tone into this one fundamental note. And I love to leave the snare drum wide open. I don't like to use any muffling or gaff tape or moon gels. So some of you might be wondering, what do I do to control the ring? But I'll explain that once we dive into Pro Tools coming up. Let's talk about mic selection and placement. So the snare drum is one of the most recognizable things in a song other than maybe the kick drum and the vocal. And we're spending hundreds, if not thousands of dollars when we're choosing these drums. And I just think it deserves better than an $89 SM57 on it. That's no slight against Shure, but I think we owe it to the snare drum to capture it with more than just one mic, to be able to capture the bandwidth in its entirety and capture the color and the range and the body of the drum. So to do that, you've got to have a couple more miking options on the drum. So the reason I chose the SE Electronics V7 dynamic mic for the top is because it's really focused and it gives a nice attack, a nice crack to the snare drum. Have a listen. Now it sounds great on its own, but I'm missing a little bit of that bottom end, and that's where this pencil condenser is going to come in, because it's going to give you a broader range of the snare drum. So have a listen of those two combined. Yeah, it really rounds out the bottom and fills in some of those highs to make it sizzling. Also, if you're concerned about the hi-hat bleed into these mics, my quick tip for that is to just play the hi-hat quieter. When you're recording drums, you really want to be focused on mixing yourself. You don't want to have to come back in later to carve out all of these unwanted frequencies or gate everything. You want it to be natural. So just focus on what it sounds like in your cans. So both of these mics, they're both on top of the snare, and they're about maybe 1 to 2 inches above the rim, and they're pointed right at the center of the snare so it can focus on the attack and not the overtones or the ring of the outside of the snare. With the 2 mics on top, I think it sounds really great, but I am missing a little bit of the snare wires, and it's also going to bring back in a little bit more of the low end. So let's have a listen to what those all 3 sound like. That's great. You really get some of that sizzle back without having to boost a bunch of the high end on these top mics where you're going to risk adding more cymbal noise into the mics. So let's listen to this snare side mic, because what it's going to do, since it's pointed at the shell, you're really going to get a lot of those mids back. So kind of that knocking sound, maybe around 1K. Here is that mixed in. It's awesome. So on to preamps, EQ, and compression. The folks over at BAE have made this amazing Rupert Neve style preamps and EQs. And I just love the way that they sound on the drums because it's really smooth, and if you want to drive them, you can, to get that awesome, warm analog sound. The EQs are big and really effective, and they really sweeten up the warmth from the preamp. So the V7 through the 1023 is really just getting some help in the low end because it already is a pretty focused mic. It kind of thins out on the bottom. So I'm just boosting it around 80 and 160. And then the M60 through the 1066, that also has a bump in the low end at 80. And then it also has a bump around 700 to get some of that woof back into the snare drum. And then to make it shine, shimmer, it's just a little bit of a shelf at the top around 12K. Then that going through the DBX 560, I'm going to shave off about 5 to 6 dB to just really fatten it up and give it a lot of meat compared to the V7. When we look at the M60 on the bottom, when we listen to it soloed, it doesn't sound as smooth as you would want it to be, but remember that its purpose is to complement the top 2 mics. So the top 2 mics are really going to be warm and buttery, and then the bottom mic is really going to add back in the rest of the snare wire sound, and all of that is going to live in the mid-range. So right now we've got that bumped at 150, a light cut at 800, and at 1.5K, and then at 15K I'm putting in just a little bit of a shelf to add some more sparkle from the wires. A side note about the snare bottom mic, don't forget to flip the phase on it, because what it's going to do is it's going to put it in line with the top 2 mics, because if they're out of phase, then they're really going to fall flat and sound papery and just gross. So the 57 on the side, like I said before, really just adds in some of the mids. I find it most effective when I'm using like a really low, deep, gushy snare, like that big fat snare sound. And the TONELUX compressor on this really just beefs it up. So I've got a fast attack on it, medium release, just to duck the transient, to kind of just squash it and fatten it up. So let's check out what's going on inside of Pro Tools for these 4 mics. So first things first, I'm going to select all 4 mics, and just like the kick drum, I'm going to send them to a bus. And I've already got a bus laid out here. It's called snare, obviously. And the shortcut for this is to select all 4 tracks, and then you're going to hold down Shift, Option, and click, and then select the snare bus. As I'm mixing, I'm going to start listening to the V7. And like I said before, it's kind of missing that low end. So I'm going to add in the M60. And you can really hear that compressor on the M60 taking effect. And you're getting a lot of snare wires. So that's why my snare bottom is normally about 5 to 10 dB below the other 2 snare top mics. And then if you add in the snare side, you're just going to get a little bit more of that mid attack. So all 4 of these mics really sound good. We just need to do a little bit of cleaning up. So we're gonna go ahead and put on this Waves F6 EQ. You could use the Pro Tools EQ, it's all fine. Because what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna probably take out just a little bit of the lows, and then I'm gonna make it shine on the high end. I really like where everything is sitting already. So let's have a listen. So I like the way that these are all sounding together, but it is sounding a little bit harsh and I need to tame it. So I'm going to put on a DBX 160. And I'm really just going to take off, again, maybe 2 to 5 dB. I'm going to turn this ratio down to 3. And then I'll probably put the mix around 75, but I'll have a listen to it and then I'll show you why I do that. So that sounds really cool, but it's starting to get into that pumpy range. So that's why I want to turn the mix down to be able to put back some of those transients. Gosh, that sounds so great. So surprise, surprise, my next favorite plugin is going to be the Infected Mushroom Pusher. And again, I'm not sure exactly what this does, but it seems like it just focuses the entire snare sound. So have a listen to this and I'll A/B it for you. And let's hear all of that in the mix. So as I said at the beginning of the video, there's still a good bit of ring to the snare, but I think that's a good ring. And then on top of that, we still have to look at the bigger picture and the fact that there's going to be at least 4 to 5 more steps of compression throughout the drum bus, and then the parallel bus, and then the mix bus, plus limiters. And so it really doesn't bother me that that ring is there because I just don't want to carve it out because I'm going to lose too much of the body of the snare. So with that being said, that wraps up today's video about the snare drum. I hope you understand the importance of the snare drum because like the kick and the vocal, it's the most recognizable part of the song. So it deserves to be dealt with precision and care. If you like what you saw and you want me to keep making more videos, please like and subscribe. If you have any comments, feel free to drop them in the comments section below. And I hope you guys have a great week. Happy practicing.